Once again, you are in the Web3 track room. Thank you so much. My name is Sasha Wallinger, and I'm very happy to see some familiar faces. We've been talking a lot about different things today. It's really fascinating. I was just speaking to the upcoming speaker about all these different standards and the history and the evolution, the future. Next conversation will be Donna Davis, and she'll be speaking about the ethics of embodied identities in the evolution of digital communities. So please, a warm welcome to Donna Davis. Thank you. Thank you.
I think I'll go to the stairs.
Yes.
Try not to tumble my way across the stage. So good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for being here. The later it gets, the more sparse we become as we seek the heat and the great outdoors. So thank you for taking the time to be here today. I am Donna Davis from the University of Oregon, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about the ethics of embodied identities. As we've been talking about Web3, we've been talking about the metaverse, we've been talking about all of XR and how that all collides and doesn't. But at the center of all of that is identity. And as we think about embodied identity, I think it's really important for us to think about what does it mean to have a body, an avatar in these spaces, and what are the ethics behind that, both from our own perspective as well as the people that are creating these the options for us, or limiting the options for us, especially as we start to think about them as places of work. That is AI's vision of me, and I actually found those glasses online in an AI platform. They're on their way, so eventually that will become me, perhaps. But it's important as we also think about digital communities, because I have an avatar that's almost 16 years old, that's been very engaged in an online community that entire time, and truly we do build community. But as we're starting to think about these platforms as, again, as places of work and places of living, not just as a game space or a social space, but as spaces that are far more serious. And as they evolve, we have to think about those ethical implications as we think about that influence on the individuals and on the society that we're working in. And I want to explore in this time with you the critical ethical aspects associated with embodied identities, again, as I've said, as we're thinking about work. So as we think about embodied identity, how do we define that? I have people all the time that go, what's an avatar? People that don't work or live in my circle really sometimes don't understand who I am or what I do. So I think it's really important as we think about online identity, when you think about embodied identities, that we think about these aspects of embodied identity, and I'm going to cover each of them. But self-presentation, it's like, how do we choose to go to work every day? How do we choose to dress to stay at home and hang out or go with friends? It's almost like we have been using avatars in our physical world our whole lives. We carry different identities depending on the situation that we move in. So as we think about self-presentation as it exists in an embodied and virtual space, what does that mean? What about avatar design? And I'm going to talk about that a lot. Usernames and profiles. My avatar in Second Life is 3D Felicissimo. 3D is, if you go to Latin, the Latin roots of that, tre is 3, and D. I am Dr. Donna Davis. So in fact, I am 3D. I am 3D. And back then you had to choose from their last names, and I graduated from high school in Italy, so Felicissimo is very happy. So I'm very happily 3D. But what goes into your profile, and what do you choose to put in that profile? What are you required to put in that profile? And who determines those things? Is it something you get to do, or is it something the company is telling you have to do, depending on what platform you're in? What about privacy? I was in for the session with the IEEE standards folks, and privacy. We've heard it all day, and I'm sure we're going to hear it for the next 2 days. What does privacy mean in these spaces? We hear a lot about, especially in news headlines, about deception. So if I choose an avatar, like the one you saw in the previous slide, that isn't exactly like me, am I deceiving people? Have you ever tried to, well, how many of y'all have avatars? Okay, and have you ever tried to make one that looked like a middle-aged, overweight woman with gray, curly hair? Ugh, no, I'm not gonna do it. It just doesn't even, it looks worse than me. It looks way worse. So, and why would I wanna do that? So, am I deceiving people by using the template that they've created for me? These are things that I'm gonna talk about. And then the use of our RL, our real life identity. Do we have to use our real life identity? Depending on the situation and the platform, that'll be an important question. So then you have to overlap that. Think about the convergence of those elements of embodied identity and the affordances that are created for us through the technologies. So if you think about the affordances of immersive platforms, you have an internet, and if your internet connection is slow, you can't function as fluidly or quickly as others, and it becomes a part of your identity. Do you have voice? Are you allowed to use voice? Is that an option? Are you required to use text? What about a keyboard and a mouse? What about download speed so that you're lagging and waiting for things to happen while everybody else is flying by? And then, of course, there's our cognitive abilities and how can our brain connect to the interfaces that we're working with. So both those elements of embodied identity and the affordances that the technology creates that becomes part of our identity are what create our avatar identities in these spaces. So today we're going to talk about each of these, that convergence of these things, with an understanding of what is an avatar and avatar identity, how important is customization, what about movement and our ability to move in these spaces, what about that sense of place, how do we interact with others, and what are the affordances of interactivity, and what is the expectation of interactivity, the role of presence. Anybody that's worked in any sort of virtual environment knows how important presence and immersion are in those spaces. How engaged do we feel in that space by feeling present and immersed, that we are sharing this space and experience with others. So let's get started with avatar identity. And as we think about avatar identity, we have a whole generation that has grown up thinking that that block is awesome. Roblox, if you've had an avatar, or you work in or know or have children in Roblox, that's their avatar and they are good with it. And that's tradie on the other side that's very highly customized. There are things that you can do in certain platforms to customize your avatar. Okay, she's thinner, and she definitely doesn't have wrinkles. But I tried to go with gray hair, and she's got glasses, and she's professional. She might have wings for different occasions. But as we think about these identities, think about who you're talking about, who's your audience, who are you, how do you want to present yourself, and how important is that element of, as we think about customization. Am I okay with being a block? And if you think about that from an employer's perspective, as we were just listening about ed tech in here a minute ago, what is the expectation of a body? And to me, a Roblox avatar is kind of like standardization and wearing uniforms at school. So everybody's equal because you're all blocks. There's no question about it. But then do I really relate to myself if I'm a Roblox block? So as we think about identity and as you think about if you're the person creating these environments and communities and platforms, who will build and staff your metaverse, and what's the expectation of identity in those spaces? And these are the many faces of tradie Felicimo. She was in alt space, RIP alt space, and that's about as good as I could get. And I actually did have blue hair at the time. Then below that is my avatar speaking at Meta a year and a half ago at a leadership summit. you can see some common themes in there, but the third one, second from the right, is my avatar in Verbella. And I really have a hard time dealing with myself as a Verbella avatar, although they've just upgraded them and they're still pretty awful. But you know, I am forced into the body of a white female with gray. That's as good as I could do with curly hair, which is actually what they consider also. It's in the African American or black hairstyles. So we're limited. And then there is Trey D, who definitely has had a lot of money put into her. But again, a little bit more stylized. So I've done a project recently with my friend and colleague from Cornell, Andrea Stevenson-Wan, where we talk about the customization and exploration of identity. And we think of it on this grid of looking at the top being identity-based self-presence, the bottom being experience-based phenomenological self-presence. So it's like, what do I have to be versus I'm creating my identity based on the experience I want to have in that space. And then we've got the spectrum that's on the horizontal plane going from consistent with your physical self to being discrepant from your physical self. And so you can see avatars that aren't even human. If you look at that bottom right quadrant, that is experience-based, and I don't have to look like me. I want to be a happy elephant in the space that I'm in, and that's what's required, or there's no requirement, so there's no judgment. That's what I am. At the top, I'm still going to be thinking more about self-presence, but still I don't have to be the same as me. Where on this other side, you've got professional meetings. Am I required to wear a professional attire? Is there a dress code in the metaverse? Is there a dress code in virtual environments? Yes, there are for places that are creating work cultures. And then at the bottom, it's like, okay, I'm going to be in a social space so I can look more relaxed, more casual, but I'm still going to be a female human, a female brown human in this case. Thinking about it on those spectrums, think about why you're there, what you want to achieve, and what's required in that process. So I was working with some folks at the Mayo Clinic years ago, where they actually would host meetings in Second Life. I think I call Second Life now the legacy VR. It is, but it's growing again. But the folks at the Mayo Clinic had a dress code. You had to come in professional attire, which 10 years ago, finding professional attire in that platform was nearly impossible. So they had somebody that showed up one day in a loincloth, and they're like, work attire. And it was a doctor for the Mayo Clinic who said, you forget, I'm working in the forest of the Amazon. This is my work attire. So, okay, what is that? Think about the way we identify what is work attire, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. Is it appropriate for me to have purple hair in this world? Today, it's not so bizarre, but the first time I did it, somebody said, come on, how old are you? So we have these judgments that are placed on us based on what we do, where we live, how old we are. All of those things that make up our physical identity are carried with us into these virtual worlds. So as we think about what our choice of identity is, then we get in this, as we're talking about the elements of identity in the spaces, privacy and consent. What is my identity, and who has the opportunity to tap into it? So what is public or private? Again, that's something we're hearing about in so many of the different sessions today, and I'm sure tomorrow. But is my data, going back to that previous slide, a lot of people are willing to say, here, you can have my identity because that's the cost of being able to play or to be engaged. So here it is, you can have it, I don't care. And on the other end of that is like, I really want to protect my identity. I want my privacy. I don't want any of my data available. So maybe I'm going to pay for an account that keeps my data private instead. Do you require personal information as you're creating an account? That mile-long list of all of the terms and conditions that you click the little tiny box at the end that says, I agree? What have you just agreed to, and how much are they collecting on you? That's part of your identity, both in the physical and the virtual world. And does the user have control of that data? That was something we just heard from IEEE in here a half an hour ago. Do you give user control of their identity? And then transparent privacy policies and informed consent. So if you're the organization creating these spaces where people are going to be functioning, how have you set these things up to protect people and their identity and their data? As we think about movement and we think about the design of movement, it's really interesting. An example of somebody in a headset where your hand controllers become your movement. I traveled to Linden Lab in high fidelity with a 30-year-old man in a wheelchair with very severe cerebral palsy. Movement for him was what he could do with his foot on a mouse that allowed his avatar to move. So movement, and then I'm one of those people that gets really motion sick in a headset. I study this, I do this for a living, and I get sick. So for me, movement is very limited, and I typically have to be on a screen, not in a headset. I'm fine on the screen, I'm not okay in a headset. And in Altspace, if you didn't have hand controllers and a headset on, your movement was different. And people are like, well, why don't you have a headset on? I was like, I became lower class almost instantly by others who saw me as less than because I wasn't in the VR version. So it's really interesting how we think about movement as a part of our identity. When we were at Linden Lab, we put, Cody wanted to wear, the person in the wheelchair wanted to wear a headset. And because he was so severely disabled, he was not able to work or walk. And my colleague said, why don't we put the hand controller on his foot? And his caregiver said, you know, he just had hip surgery and he refuses to do his physical therapy. So I'm not sure how much mobility he's going to have from the hip to move. We put it on his foot and he started to kick. And as he did, he watched the avatar on the screen wave his arm, something that he physically had never been able to do. And he started wailing the most joyful noise that the entire block would have been able to hear. It was like mobility became different for him in that very moment. So as we think about embodied identity and design, think about people whose movement might not be normative. And what are you doing for design in allowing people to have movement that doesn't become part of a stereotype and a bias? So even as we think about keyboards and mice, anybody know what this graphic is from? Sansar is another VR platform that if you're working on a screen base instead of a headset, these are the controls for the keyboard. And sometimes, I've worked with people with Parkinson's. What if you have tremor and your keyboard and mouse are not easily managed? They make a ton of typos, and they constantly say, people think I'm drunk or stupid because my hands don't work on the keyboard the way others do. So when the keyboard becomes a part of our identity by virtue of our ability or inability to use it very easily, it can become part of our identity. Sense of place. Of course, I use a home environment instead of a work environment, but we're hearing a lot about digital twins. Are you creating a digital twin of your space and place that allows people to feel at home in that space? I should have used an image of, I direct the Oregon Reality Lab at the university based in Portland, and we teach and create in that and do research in the lab. And I've recreated the lab in 3D. So, and especially during COVID, I would have meetings in the virtual lab. And every time people would go, oh, it's so nice to be back. Oh, wait, I'm not back, but I'm in the lab and it feels like I'm back. That sense of place becomes part of our identity. And who controls that place? When I was a newbie, I remember meeting a group of people who were part of a Grateful Dead community. They were a bunch of deadheads. And they had homes in this space. And one day they logged in and the sim was empty. It was gone. And it was an identity crisis. It's like, my home is gone and I've done nothing. They had no control over it and they lost it by virtue of one person's actions. Can people create their own sense of place? Just as we might have an office where we put our own personal touch in there to make it feel like our own. Are you giving people the opportunity to create their own sense of place that's part of that emotional attachment that people have to space, have with place, especially as we think about what does place mean to us now, where so many people are working remotely, in the office, or at home. So when we think about how do you create that sense of space and place that people can relate to, and are you making it open and safe, or is it secure, and how do you regulate that? Again, early days, I was working with a Fortune 100 company who was trying to figure out how to connect with their global workforce. And they were looking at virtual platforms in the very early days. And of course, because I had been doing work in Second Life, I was like, yeah, no. Because it was very difficult to lock things down. There was a problem with griefers. It's better now. But who controls that space and how do you protect that space? So if it's in the cloud, if it's its own space on your own server, or is it something that's an open environment that you want people, especially if you're in the marketing world, you want people to come to that space. So who's got control of that? As we think about interactivity, this is the person I was just talking about as we were visiting Linden Lab. But what are you doing about accessibility? So as we think about interactivity, think of someone who is deaf. And I worked with a deaf woman for several years whose own family never learned American Sign Language. So basically go to the company or the family picnic, and she was relegated, bring your books and sit at the picnic table, because she couldn't play with the other kids because she couldn't keep up. And she found a space where almost all the communication was in text. Nobody even knew she was deaf. It opened up a whole new social world for her. And her identity became one not as the deaf girl, but as just another person in the group. Similarly, when we would have meetings with a disability community, we would always have somebody who was typing, when transcribing when people were using voice. And if somebody was using text, we always had somebody that would speak the text so that we covered the deaf and the blind community. What are you doing in design to address these issues that are really important? Presence and immersion, of course, feeling present and immersed is, I'd love to see a show of hands. How many of you have been in screen-based virtual environments? Okay. How about headset-based virtual environments? Okay. Does anybody in here believe that you cannot feel present or immersed in a screen-based virtual world? Thank you. Thank you. I agree. We can be very immersed. This particular photograph was taken, I was teaching a class with my graduate students. I created, of course, we're the University of Oregon Ducks. So of course I have a duck avatar. And my student was in the duck avatar, and we had a TV in the basement of the place we were going to start our adventure in. And we were doing a live YouTube stream that was being cast on the TV in the virtual basement. So this is my student wearing the duck avatar, looking at her human wearing the headset via YouTube. Talk about a blend of cultures and spaces. But it was incredibly powerful for her to have this interesting mirror of feeling present in both places and immersed in both places at the same time. As we think about authenticity and integrity, I love to use my warrior AI identity to say, I am authentic. And my activity in this space, I like to think of having the utmost integrity. So authenticity is fundamental to ethical concern in digital communities. But authenticity doesn't mean that I have to look exactly like my human. It's more about the way I interact with others, my behavior in that space. Certainly, I have to be very transparent. I'm an academic. So I have to say, hi, I'm a researcher, just so you know. So it's really important. But do we really need to ensure that embodied identities have to reflect an individual's true self? I worked with an 80-year-old, well, she was 90 eventually, 90-year-old woman with Parkinson's. I went to Southern California to visit with her, and it was like when she turned on the computer and her avatar appeared, it was like somebody gave her air again. And she pointed to the screen and said, that's the real me, not the me trapped inside this broken old body. It was like she was more authentically herself in her avatar than she was in her human. So, because that's the way she felt, not how she was labeled. And as we think also about harassment and discrimination, this is actually an image of Linden Lab's cornfield. Back in the old days, if you were a griefer, you'd get sent to the cornfield and your account couldn't get back in for a certain period of time. But as we think about harassment and discrimination, what are we doing about it? Is anonymity important? Embodied identities can be also targets for hate speech and cyberbullying. What are the things that you're doing and building to make sure that these things, and what policies and mechanisms do you put in place to prevent harassment? And my final slide, I'm going to say, thank you, AI. My prompt was, Dr. Davis pondering the future of the metaverse in the lab. This was the image that these were the images that Dolly gave me. Thank you, Dr. Davis. So none of them look like me, but as we think about algorithms and bias, these are the things that you also have to think about as we think about the ethics of identity in virtual worlds. So with that, I know I am out of time, but that was the end.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you. Round of applause.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.